Okay, we are moving right along, getting finished. As we hit the 21st century, this lecture is going to be a little bit about George W. Bush, but mostly we'll be looking at the continuing war on terror that the United States is engaged in. I don't know if this is part of life as we will forever know it, or if it's just this phase that we happen to have been in for the last 2 decades. But it is a big part of our life now, and we've got to talk about how it started and where it's come from. So we start with the Bush administration. We'll talk about first the election of the year 2000. The Democrats nominated this guy, Al Gore. Al Gore was Bill Clinton's vice president, and even though Clinton's administration kind of finished on that idea of scandal and just really kind of seedy stuff, Clinton himself remained popular. And so for the Democrats, the nominating contest wasn't really that intense. Al Gore was going to be the nominee, and there was some hope, and you would expect that some of Clinton's popularity would kind of transfer to Al Gore because he was his vice president. Unfortunately, Al Gore has the personality of the computer screen you are watching this from. The Republican nomination was a little bit more interesting, but by the end of March, it was kind of wrapped up, and the Republicans had nominated George W. Bush. He was, at that point, he was the governor of Texas. He's also, if you don't know this, the son of the former President George H.W. Bush, who had served before Clinton. The Green Party also nominated this guy, Ralph Nader. Now, he's not that important. So why do I mention him? Because in the election of 2000, everything is going to go haywire due to voting problems in the state of Florida. And remember, I'm giving you the short version. It's much, much more intricate than this. But as we got down to election night, in what was believed to be a very close election, as the returns started to come in, if you've watched a presidential election before, you will notice as the polls close, within a few minutes, the news media will declare that one state has voted for one candidate or another. That's called calling a state. Well, early on, the news media called Florida for Al Gore. Gore has won Florida. And as the night went on, if Gore won Florida, he was ahead in the electoral vote totals. However, the actual votes that were being reported were not matching what the media was predicting would have happened, and eventually they had to go back on their calling of Florida, and they threw it back in the undecided column. Then eventually they would say, well, alright, it looks like Bush is going to win. Then the vote totals would change again, and so they would have to... It was very, very confusing. But eventually, after counting all the votes in Florida, George Bush was declared to be the winner. But the vote was so close. On election night, at the end of election night, the vote was so close that it triggered an automatic recount, where all the ballots were run back through the counting machines. And at the end of the recount, George Bush was still ahead, but originally he'd only been ahead by just over 500 votes. After the recount, he was only ahead by just over 300 votes. That is in the entire state of Florida. Millions of people there. George Bush is only ahead by a couple of hundred votes, and so Al Gore demanded a recount, but he didn't want a full recount. He only wanted a recount from 4 heavily Democratic counties. that he said there were voting irregularities in and not all the votes were counted. George Bush, of course, sued to stop the recounts. Gore countersued the state of Florida to make them force the counties to do the recounts. 2 counties wanted to do the recounts. 2 counties didn't because they said we weren't going to have enough time. Ultimately, this worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling, ruled, like I said, I'm oversimplifying this, that it would be unfair to only count the votes in the 4 counties. That would be unfair to the rest of the voters in Florida who may or may not have their votes counted. That it would be unfair to the Bush team that had followed the process. That it would be unfair to the government of Florida that had a deadline they had to meet to certify the vote. And so ultimately the Supreme Court stopped the recount, and George Bush was elected President of the United States, with Al Gore essentially allowing him to claim the election without continuing to pursue a lawsuit. Supposedly some advisors told Al Gore that he could continue the lawsuits, but that ultimately it wouldn't have mattered. There were a group of newspapers in Florida who actually went through and they purchased the ballots in the 4 counties, and they conducted their own recount. The idea was we're going to see who really won. And it's interesting. This has always struck me as very interesting. Al Gore, in pursuing the recount, he wanted the votes counted a particular way. He wanted every vote that looked like a vote to count. And the newspapers, when they applied that standard to recounting the vote, they found that George Bush would have won by just over 2,000 votes. He would have picked up votes, actually. When they applied a narrower standard, George Bush still would have won, but he would have won by less. When they applied a very narrow standard, this is the way it's going to be. He would have won by the 300 or so votes. And actually, Bush, even though he didn't want the recount to happen, he did say if it's going to happen, it has to happen this way. It has to be an actual vote. None of this other, if you want to look up dimpled Chad or hanging Chad, you can. But the policy Bush was pursuing, if there had been a recount, actually would have given Gore the state of Florida. So that's always struck me as very ironic and interesting. But this is how the vote shook out. And why did I mention Ralph Nader a while ago? I mean, you look at the percent of the vote he got, roughly 2-ish%. In the state of Florida, they did the math. And the popular votes for Ralph Nader in Florida, if one person out of every 12 precincts in Florida had switched their vote from voting for Ralph Nader to voting for Al Gore, then Al Gore would have come out on top. There wouldn't have been a reason for him to sue and try to force those 4 counties to revote. So the idea that my vote doesn't count, yes, one vote does count. Because in this instance, one vote for a guy who wasn't going to win potentially swung the election in favor of Bush. If you are a Democrat, you blame Ralph Nader for Al Gore losing Florida and therefore losing the election in the year 2000. Now, President Bush got elected, and so let's look at some of the high points of the Bush administration. It's difficult with there being less than 20 years between the Bush administration and now. It's very difficult to kind of objectively talk about the Bush administration because we are so polarized. Right now, there are a lot of people who miss President Bush who probably didn't miss him back in the day because things have changed so much. So I'm just going to kind of hit the main things and try to provide it with as objective description as possible. Some of the big things that happened while President Bush is in office, one of the big things was Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, mostly hitting the panhandles. You don't think of panhandles in Alabama or Mississippi, but Louisiana also, especially the city of New Orleans. If you know anything about the geography of New Orleans, it sits below sea level. And so there's a whole series of dams and levees that are designed to keep the Gulf of Mexico from flowing into New Orleans. When a hurricane comes in, there's something called the storm surge, which is where it's pushing the water up and over its normal crests. There are pumps in New Orleans that are designed to pump water out of New Orleans every single day. They pump water out of New Orleans. Well, there was so much water and the winds were so powerful that the pumps in New Orleans failed. And when water built up in areas that it shouldn't have built up, the levees and the dams failed and broke, and a large portion of the city of New Orleans flooded. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, was really unable to deal with that effectively. President Bush, in his second term in office, called for immigration reform, and he had a kind of a more comprehensive plan for what he wanted to do. It would have included guest workers, which would allow people to come to the United States to work with the intention of them sending money back to their families, like many people do. Unfortunately, it was ignored by Congress, and we're still having this debate over what will we do about immigration. It's something that's been talked about, but nobody in Congress really wants to do anything about it. There, okay, providing my own context. Now, probably what President Bush is going to be known for is the beginnings of the War on Terror. Where did terrorism against the United States begin? That's hard to pinpoint. Possibly it began in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, when a more militant Islam began to take hold in the Middle East. In 1983, with the Marines being bombed in Lebanon that we've talked about in the Reagan notes. Maybe that was the beginning of terrorism against the United States, because with that, when the Marines were attacked, the government response was not to strike back. The government response was to pull out. And so there's some people that say that in that moment, terrorists knew that if you hit the United States and bloody their nose, they'll back down, which in theory encourages more. Certainly, we have to agree that by 1993, when terrorists attempted their first attack on the World Trade Center, the War on Terror was already going on. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. They parked a truck full of explosives in the basement, hoping to take out the support pillars to cause the collapse of the building. In 1998, the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were simultaneously bombed. There was devastation there. And in October of 2000, off the coast of Yemen, there was an attack on the USS Cole, which resulted in the deaths of over a dozen U.S. sailors. And so the War on Terror had been going on for a long time. Investigations later would come to the conclusion that the terrorists were at war with us, but we were not yet at war with them on September 11th, 2001. The morning of September 11, 2001, terrorists from a group known as Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 passenger planes. 2 of those planes were flown into the Twin Towers, the 2 towers that made up the World Trade Center. There are very few videos or photographs of the first plane hitting the World Trade Center because it was a normal day. It was like any other. But when the first plane hit, and you can barely in this photograph make out the smoke from the first tower, all the news media in New York turned their cameras toward the towers, and there are plenty of videos of the second plane hitting. A third plane was flown into the Pentagon, essentially strafing the parking lot almost at ground level, hitting the outer wall, with the damage extending into the 5th ring of the Pentagon. And then the 4th one, by the time the 4th one was hijacked, we're not really sure what its intended target was, because by that point, the passengers on that plane were able to call their loved ones and say, we've been hijacked, and they were able to get word that the World Trade Center had been hit and the Pentagon had been hit, and the black box recordings from that plane crash indicate that the passengers were in the process of trying to retake the plane to keep it from hitting whatever its intended target was. The U.S. response to this, in December of 2001, we launched our invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was our target because the government of Afghanistan was controlled by a group known as the Taliban, and the Taliban had provided aid and comfort to this man, Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who had planned the terrorist attacks on September 11th. And so our goal was not only to remove the Taliban, but also to capture and or kill Osama bin Laden. In 2003, as part of our expanded war on terrorism, the Bush administration alleged that Iraq had not only been providing support for Al-Qaeda, but also had been hiding weapons of mass destruction, nerve gas, chemical weapons, potential nuclear weapons. And so the United States went to the UN and announced that we would be invading Iraq. Those weapons of mass destruction were never found. Now, there are competing anti-administration theories as to why. One group says that they were never found because they were never there. Another group actually said they were never found because in the time it took the United States to announce they were there and the actual invasion, that they were moved out. Which then has the unintended consequence of saying, okay, so there were weapons of mass destruction. This was a very unpopular invasion. Several people from the United States actually flew to Iraq to put themselves as human shields around what they considered to be civilian targets. Some of them got upset and came back when they would say, we were going to camp out on the top of this school building, and then the Iraqi government moved the children out and put soldiers inside of it. That did happen. Now, ultimately, Saddam Hussein, the same dictator from Iraq who had invaded Kuwait, he was finally forced from power. He fled Baghdad to try to hide out. Eventually, he was found by U.S. forces, turned over to the Iraqi government. The new Iraqi government that has been in power since that time, they did execute Saddam Hussein for his crimes against the people of Iraq. However, they have had a terrible time trying to keep the country together and hold the country together. There are so many, not only religious, but also regional differences between the people of Iraq. In the north, you have the Kurds, who are their own ethnic group. They're still Muslim, but they're their own ethnic group. You have the Sunnis who controlled government and controlled essentially the middle of the country for so long. And then you have the Shiites down in southern Iraq who have religious differences with the Sunnis and have always felt oppressed. And so there are these autonomous governments that control the north and the south, and the main government just really doesn't have a whole lot of control over the entire country. Now, as we started our war on terror and prosecuted it in the initial years, there were some controversies. One of them was, what do we do with the prisoners that we take? If we invade Afghanistan and capture members of Al-Qaeda, what are they? They're not really prisoners of war, because we haven't declared war on anybody. So they're not all individually accused of committing crimes in and against the United States. So what do you do with them? What are they? And ultimately what was decided was they would be sent to Guantanamo Bay to await trial. We will leave them at Guantanamo Bay, which is a U.S. base in Cuba, and we'll leave them there while they wait on trial. However, that leads to another question. What kind of trial are they going to have? Are we going to put them on trial in a civilian court? Are we going to bring them to New York to answer for the September 11th terrorist attacks that they may or may not individually have been a part of? Are we going to put them on trial in military court before a military tribunal? If they're not a soldier, is it legal in terms of not only American law, but in terms of international law to put them on trial in a military tribunal? And then what would we do with them after conviction? Where are we going to put them in prison? Are we going to leave them in Guantanamo Bay? It's not designed for that. We're going to imprison them here in America? Are we going to find another country to take them? And then what will we do with them when they're released? Will they be released? These are all questions that nobody has a really good answer for. And here we are 20 years down the road and we still don't have good answers for it. After he was inaugurated in 2009, President Obama, one of his campaign promises had been to close Guantanamo Bay. But the administration still couldn't answer some of those questions. They tried, and so Guantanamo Bay remains open, holding these suspects. President Obama changed up the war on terror a bit. He preferred to use drone strikes. And I know we have our own little drones around here that fly, these are military grade drones that you see in the picture. They're much larger, and so they can be equipped with weapons and missiles to target specific individuals, to hit a car, to hit one person's house. Okay? And so the idea behind that is that it limits collateral damage. Well, President Obama liked using drone strikes and used them to great effect. But that leads to other questions. Is it right for us to use drone strikes in other countries without their permission? Can we fly drones in Saudi Arabia and take out a terrorist leader without their knowledge, consent? Can we use them in Yemen? Can we use them against targets elsewhere? Can we use them against citizens of other countries? And even that presents another question. Can we target Americans who may have joined these terror groups without first giving them their due process rights? If you are an American citizen and the United States government is going to take action against you, theoretically, the due process rights found in the Constitution are still in effect. And so these are very good questions. Now, the war on terrorism, as I have stated, it has continued. After 2010, the Arab Spring, there was the creation of a group called the Islamic State of the Levant and Syria. Okay? Or, as we know it better, ISIS. ISIS was able to get started in Syria as a result of the Arab Spring. There was a revolution in Syria, and that was a nightmare scenario. You had the government of Syria backed by Russia. You had the revolutionaries in Syria backed by the United States. And then this group called ISIS took over. And there's competing evidence as to whether or not the United States, I would say, accidentally helped cause the rise of ISIS. They may allegedly presented themselves as friends of the revolution and then tried to install their own Islamic caliphate, a much more radical and militant version of Islam. But they all of a sudden started fighting not only the government of Syria, but also the U.S.-backed rebels in Syria, and were able to take over huge parts of the country and spread into northern Iraq, where they ended up fighting the Kurds in Iraq and other people within Iraq, spreading their own very militant and, I would argue, twisted version of Islam. Eventually, they were beaten back by forces from the United States and Iraq and Turkey and Russia and the Syrian government and the Syrian rebels. We were all kind of fighting each other, and at the same time, everybody agrees we're all going to fight ISIS. Other countries helped also provide support. I remember Jordan, the country of Jordan, was providing some fighter support, trying to help in the fight against ISIS. One of their fighter planes was shot down. The pilot was captured by ISIS, and he was very gruesomely executed. And as a result, Jordan's King Abdullah, one of the coolest things I've seen, who was a trained fighter pilot, he led the next fighter attack from Jordan on ISIS positions in Syria. I thought that was kind of cool. Where else are you going to get, your king to lead troops in battle at this day and age? Now, recently, ISIS has been declared destroyed, and I put this in quotation marks because President Trump has launched a couple of strikes against some of the main leaders of ISIS. And those leaders have been killed, and so ISIS has been declared defeated. However, Al-Qaeda has been declared defeated, and yet there are still followers of them. There are still followers of ISIS out there. They've lost territory to the point of they don't even register on the map anymore. But does destroying ISIS actually accomplish our goal of ending the war on terrorism? Does it actually destroy ISIS? Or is something else waiting in the wings to take their place? Just another question that needs to be answered. Hopefully, in a positive way for us and the rest of the world. We are almost done with the year. Thank you for listening.